Purpose here will be to talk about where the various wear points are on these parts, and also what's likely to break, and some of the things that will happen when those parts do wear or break. So it's not going to be to give an explanation of how these parts interact with each other. There are other sources that can be found on this. It's just basically to kind of see how these parts wear, and also which parts are most likely to break in the gun. In case you have a issue with the gun, maybe this will help in troubleshooting it. I'll start here by hanging some names on these things. The top ones, of course, are hammers, followed down here by our mainsprings, and then we've got our triggers with the tip up here known as the sear. Got our hands and a handspring attached, and then we've got our bolts, and these actually have two springs, left and a right arm, you might say. And finally down here we got our bolt spring on the right hand side of this one, and the one that puts pressure on the trigger on this side over here. So those are the basic 6 parts we got in here, and those are the kind of the names that are pretty much standard for these 6 parts. We'll start with our top row of hammers here. The first 3 are out of a percussion gun or belong to percussion guns. One on the right over here, Colt single action army cartridge gun. Wear points up here in the percussion guns. We're going to find that the area that hits the percussion cap and also can contact the nipple up there, that'll get dented in sometimes, and you're going to get some wear on that, but normally speaking that doesn't cause any real issues with the firing of the gun. We've also got the bored out hole in the center here, and these things, if you keep a little oil in those things, they're going to last for an awful long time before it gets noticeable or causes any issues. And this wheel on the back, same thing, that rides up against the back side of the mainspring, and I've never seen that really go bad on any of the guns. The point here that can wear and cause a noticeable change is what we call this cam area in here, and that's responsible for dropping that bolt at the correct time on the cylinder. And if this right hand side wears some, what will happen is that bolt will start dropping sooner, and it might even drop somewhat before that pre-notch in the gun, and it really doesn't cause a lot of issues as far as shooting the gun goes, but it just isn't the way it should be. And if you want to get that back to 100%, you probably need to buy a new hammer, or maybe get a gunsmith to replace that cam on that hammer. I should mention too, there's a fair difference in the hammers between the single action army and the percussion guns. Of course, we got up here the mechanism on the single action army that sets off the primer, and that's missing on this one. Other big noticeable change or difference is that we've got 3 notches on the single action. First one up here is kind of a safety, so you bring the hammer back just maybe a quarter or half inch, no, probably quarter inch, and the sear will go into this notch, and that'll keep the firing pin from contacting the primer. So it's called a safety notch. The second one down here is our half cock position, allows the rotation of the cylinder. The third one down here then would be the full cock position on the hammer. Other noticeable thing would be when you're cocking the gun back, because of these 3 notches on a single action army, you're going to get 3 clicks right in here, and the 4th click would be when this bolt comes up against the bottom of the cylinder. It's not necessarily in that order, but you're going to get 4 clicks on the single action cartridge gun, where since this one over here is missing the safety notch, 3 on this one would be the number that we're looking for. So a little difference in that between the 3 clicks on this one and 4 here if they're properly timed. You're going to get 5 on this one if they're a little off, and 4 on this if they're a little off. And I said before in another video that does not really be an issue as far as I'm concerned. I'm dropping down from the hammers here. We're going to come to our mainsprings, and these are the things that you probably have the least amount of problems with. I don't think I've ever had one break. I have seen some where somebody has taken a grinder and kind of reduced the tension on these things. Various ways of doing that. Some people put a piece of leather in the back of the between the mainspring here and the frame itself. The one on the right over here is a single action, from a single action, and there's not a lot of difference between that and the percussion ones. They're not going to interchange too well. This mainspring out of the single action is fairly long, and the curvature is just a little different, or at least it's longer than the percussion ones are. Like I say, we don't really have any major problems with these things, so that's not probably going to be a situation. I mean, if you cock the hammer back and there's no spring tension at all on it, you can bet there's an issue here. But other than that, really no problems with the mainsprings. And looking at our triggers next, we've got 3 over here, Percussion style, and one on the right hand side over here, Colt single action Army. And you can hardly tell any difference between those two. They're almost identical. I don't know if they'll interchange or not. I haven't tried that, but not a lot of difference as far as the basic shape design goes. Now up here, as far as wear points go, the very tip of these things is what we call the sear, and that definitely can wear, especially if they're not hardened correctly. Somebody's made some modifications up here, changed the angles and things. You know, that can be a wear point, and probably what will happen is as that wears, the trigger pull might start out to be 4 or 5 pounds and start dropping as the gun is used more. You know, you might get down to the point even where the gun won't stay in the cock position. It'll normally stay in the half cock position because there's a groove in here. But when it's got to sit on that little notch there, it's not very deep. It's going to have a tendency to slide off of there if this part of the sear is wore very much. So that's a point that can wear on the gun, and you got to keep an eye on that. If your gun starts to have a trigger pull that gets really light, you know, I can suspect that this is worn here. And I probably should have mentioned it up on the hammers. This notch up here can also wear, especially if it's been filed and not rehardened correctly, or the material is just plain too soft. This notch can wear, and that'll also cause the hammer to fall easier. Very light trigger pull, almost like a hair trigger. So that's the wear point on the triggers. In our top 3 items, we don't really have a lot of breakage that we're going to see occurring. Mostly wear on those things. Now we get down to our hands, and that's a whole different story because they have a very delicate part hooked onto them, and that's the spring, and that keeps the hand so it'll force out, grab the notches on the cylinder, and make it turn. And those will tend to break. I've got 2 of them over here off Percussion guns that I'm showing that have broken off. Single action look a little different. They've got two notches, and the reason for that is sometimes, well, not sometimes, but in the design, when the first notch up here falls out of the ratchets on the cylinder, the second one picks it up and continues to turn that cylinder. So that's what the 2 is about. And we've had a couple of breakage here on these 2. So when that spring does break, it's not going to allow the hand then to be forced into the notches on that cylinder. So maybe if when you cock your gun back and you find out that the cylinder isn't turning, a very likely suspect here would be that your spring on the hand is broken off, or at least maybe it's become really weak, and if it's weak enough, then that hand won't get forced out into the notches on the cylinder, and it might not turn as you bring the hammer back. So these things attach into the hammer. It's where this peg goes right in up in here. So as the hammer rotates on its axis here, that'll cause that hand to move upward, and then it'll grab the notches in the cylinder, hopefully, and if that spring isn't there, it's not going to be forced into those notches. So that's the thing that can happen if your spring breaks on your hand. So if your hand spring breaks, there are down to 2 options: to get a new hand that has a spring on it, or maybe find some way to replace the broken spring that's in that hand. If you're handy, you maybe make your own spring, or you know someone that can, and you can kind of open this up a little bit here and then fit that into it. Now the problem is with buying or getting a new hand is that these things kind of have to be fit and timed into your action. And if you could get the spring just replaced in it, you've got your old hand that was working fine in the gun, so until spring broke. So that'll go back to that situation. When that tip does wear a little bit, you're going to find that the bolt here will pop up just a little sooner in the cylinder, because we haven't rotated the cylinder enough yet when that bolt pops up. And that again won't be a real problem as long as you can bring the hammer back far enough to engage the sear here in the hammer, and by that time that bolt will have dropped into its notch in the cylinder. What will happen here if your top of your hand is wore off quite a bit, or if it got ground off for some reason, that'll cause that bolt to pop up sooner and hit the bottom of the cylinder, maybe say in this position here rather than in that pre-notch section. As long as you can still bring your hammer back further before it hits the frame, you'll be able to rotate that cylinder enough for the bolt to drop into the notch position here, and also for the sear on the trigger to engage in its full cock position. So some wear on this thing really won't cause the gun to completely malfunction, just that the bolt might pop up a little sooner and hit the cylinder and stay in this position. The hand that comes with a kit or individually is normally a little longer than it needs to be, and the reason for that is so it can be tuned. The action can be tuned when it gets into your gun. If you put it in the way it is and it's a little too long, what's going to happen is the cylinder gets locked up by the bolt, and you're still trying to turn this thing, but yet the hand is trying to push on here as you bring the hammer back. It's stopped because the bolt has locked this thing up, and the sear on the trigger probably didn't get a chance yet to lock into the right spot here, the full cock position on the hammer. So with that hand being too long, you'll find as you cock your gun back then that it won't stay in the cock position, or won't even go into the cock position. We'll take a look at the bolts next. The 5 on the left here came out of the percussion guns, and the 2 on the right are out of a Colt single, or should go into a Colt single action Army cartridge gun. And the one on the left here is called old style. We got out of this bag over here called an old style Colt bolt, and it has this stop on the end of it here. It almost looks identical to me to the percussion ones, and the newer style doesn't have that little protrusion out here. So that's the difference in the old style Colt versus the new style Colt cartridge guns. Getting over here to the black powder ones then. The bolt has, you kind of turn one of these things so you can see them. They've got 2 what I call legs or arms, and those things kind of act as springs. Purpose is that one of them rides up against the side of the frame, and the other one has to bounce over and then slide down this cam on the hammer. So if one of those legs breaks off, there may not be enough pressure to keep that hand along this section here of the cam, and the cam here on that leg moving out on the cam is what lowers the bolt and frees up the rotation for the cylinder. So we might have a situation then where your cylinder remains locked, and there's no way of getting it to unlock because that leg doesn't get in this position over here and doesn't get rotated, or doesn't get moved by the cam to slide down and unlock itself from the locking lugs here in the cylinder. And again, you can purchase those in the kit form here from Pieta, or you can get them individually. Thing about these things is they may have to be fitted into the gun again, and there may have to be some metal taken off this side. That side of the leg here may have to be shortened some, I don't know which side it is, depending on how the thing rides over that cam. So that can be an issue. I got lucky with 2 I tried here out of the Pietas, and they fit in the gun and function just fine the way they were. So I made no modifications to the arms on those, so those worked out okay. And I've worked our way down to the bolt springs. These are probably the easiest to talk about, easiest to replace, and seems to be they're the easiest ones to break. The right hand side here is the one that keeps pressure on the bolt. Left hand side keeps pressure on the trigger. And on the ones I'm showing here, these are Percussions, and I've got the actually bolt side broken off on, I guess, 4 of those things, and the trigger side broken off on one of these. And here they both snapped off when it broke apparently across here. One on the right is out of a Colt single action Army, or should go into a Colt single action Army cartridge gun, and I'm almost seeing no difference in this between the one for the Colt. A little thicker maybe across this way than the Percussion ones. Other than that, looks pretty much identical. Well, troubleshooting these is a little easier than some of the other things, because if you cock your gun and the cylinder here does not lock up, just continues to spin kind of freely, that means that the bolt section over here of the spring is not applying pressure up on the bolt. It's not locking into the notches over here. So if that's the case where you can cock your gun, comes into the full cock position, then your cylinder still rotates like this, there's a good chance that the bolt spring on this side is broken off. left hand side, if that one goes like it did over here, then we're not going to keep pressure of the trigger against the hammer here, and it will not lock up into its or stay locked very easily into this position here. I mean, it might get locked in there at some point, but it's going to be just kind of a random thing. You can kind of check that out if you put pressure on your trigger the opposite way you would pull it. See, put pressure this way, keep some pressure on it, and then cock your gun, and if the hammer locks up with that process, then you can kind of figure that it was the trigger side of the bolt spring that broke off, like the case over here. Okay, that pretty well finishes up what I want to go through on the basic parts inside the single actions, especially pertaining to the percussion guns. Hopefully it may help someone if you have an issue with your gun or someone else's, may get a better idea if you understand what we talked about here today as far as what might be an issue inside the gun and what you're maybe going to need to do as far as replacement goes. Always is a good idea to have some parts on hand. I can especially recommend having some extra bolt springs around, and those are the easiest to replace, so they're probably the first thing that'll break in the gun, there seem to be. So hopefully this has been helpful, and thanks for watching.